Have you ever wondered what truly happened to those who crossed the Roman Empire, not in the sanitized version taught in school, but in the raw, unfiltered machinery of cruelty that Rome engineered behind closed doors? What if the punishments we think we know, gladiator battles, crucifixions, arena executions, were only the surface layer, disguising a system far darker and more calculated than anything Rome displayed in public? The truth is that Roman power didn't rest only on armies or laws. It rested on fear, on rituals of suffering designed to break not just bodies, but the very identity of anyone who dared to resist. And once you understand how this machinery worked, you will never again see Rome as the civilized empire so many imagine today. At the center of this hidden world was a chilling transformation, turning human beings into symbols. Punishment in Rome was never merely a response to crime. It was a performance, a message, a demonstration of absolute dominance staged with precision. But there was an even more terrifying layer, the punishments that were never shown to crowds, the ones carried out quietly by magistrates, lictors, torturers, trained not only to inflict pain, but to shape obedience. Every action served a purpose. Every scream echoed through the hierarchy of Roman society, and behind these rituals was a cold political truth. Rome maintained control not by justice, but by spectacle and psychological engineering. Imagine being dragged into a dim stone chamber beneath an amphitheater, the sound of distant crowds fading as you descend deeper underground. The lictors who escort you aren't speaking. They don't need to. Their silence is part of the ritual, part of the intimidation that begins long before the first blow. In Rome, punishment was a language, and every gesture was a sentence being written on your body. The beating of the fasces, the searing touch of heated metal, the suffocating grip of restraining clamps, these weren't random acts of brutality. They were calibrated tools meant to communicate terror upward, outward, and across every layer of Roman life. And what makes all this even more disturbing is that much of it was deliberately hidden by the same historians who glorified Roman victories and celebrated Roman order. They preserved the empire's grandeur while burying the darkest mechanisms that kept it standing. Once you start peeling back these layers, you begin to see the empire in a new light, not as a beacon of civilization, but as a master of psychological domination who understood how to weaponize suffering with surgical precision. You start asking yourself how many of these rituals were whispered about but never recorded. How many people disappeared into chambers no one dared describe? You've probably felt it already, that strange mix of fascination and disbelief. And that reaction is exactly why stories like this need to be told. If understanding the machinery of ancient power helps you see the world differently, then tell me in the comments what struck you the most so far. Leave your like to help this investigation reach more people, and check whether you're subscribed so you don't miss the next revelations. What comes next will descend even deeper into the hidden strategies Rome used to control its people, pulling you further into a world that was never meant to be remembered. The deeper you go into the Roman world, the clearer it becomes that punishment was not an anomaly or a moment of excess. It was built directly into the architecture of Roman law itself. The system was designed to turn any citizen, freedman, or slave into a potential target the moment they stepped out of line, creating a society where obedience was not earned but engineered. Rome did not simply uphold law, it manufactured fear through a legal structure that blurred the line between justice and domination. And the terrifying part is how ordinary it all seemed to those who lived within it. When you examine the Roman courts, you notice something unsettling. Transparency was never the priority. Trials were often public, yes, but what happened before and after the verdict frequently fell into the hands of magistrates who acted with near absolute discretion. A citizen's status determined everything. A wealthy Roman might face a fine for an offense that would condemn a poorer man to flogging, enslavement, or a fate sealed in the arena. The law appeared sophisticated, full of procedures and precedents, but behind its polished surface hid a brutal truth. Roman justice existed to reinforce hierarchy, not morality. Even more disturbing was the reliance on torture as a legitimate form of evidence. Rome believed pain could reveal truth, a belief so institutionalized that entire categories of people were automatically considered unreliable unless tortured. Slaves could not testify without being subjected to agony first, as if suffering itself created honesty. Citizens weren't entirely protected either. In cases of treason or sacrilege, even a free-born Roman could be stripped of rights and subjected to the same instruments of interrogation used on the lowest members of society. Under the weight of accusation, status could evaporate in an instant, leaving anyone vulnerable to the machinery of punishment that lurked beneath the legal facade. Imagine this shift from security to terror happening in real time. One day, you walk through the forum as a respected merchant or craftsman. The next, a rival accuses you of fraud, or a neighbor claims you defied a magistrate. Suddenly, the protections you believed in dissolve. You stand before officials whose expressions reveal nothing, whose decrees carry the force of life and death. Your fate rests not on truth, but on perception, on how useful your suffering might be as an example. The system didn't need to convict everyone. It only needed enough convictions to remind the population who held power. This is where the Roman genius for psychological control becomes impossible to ignore. The law functioned like a net with holes just small enough to trap those Rome wanted to break. It allowed the state to disguise punishment as civic duty, brutality as necessary order. Citizens learned quickly that their survival depended on silence, conformity, and constant awareness of the invisible boundaries drawn around them. Those who crossed those lines, even unintentionally, discovered how swiftly the empire could transform a human being into a warning carved into the memory of everyone who witnessed their fall. As you begin to see how deeply punishment was woven into the legal fabric of Rome, the stages that follow grow even more disturbing, revealing how the empire perfected not just physical torment, but the destruction of dignity itself, turning justice into a weapon that shaped the thoughts and behaviors of millions across its vast territories. Once you understand how Roman law positioned every individual as a potential target, the next layer becomes even more chilling. Torture was not an act of desperation or cruelty from rogue officials. It was a fully sanctioned instrument of state power, deliberately shaped to break bodies, extract confessions, and send unmistakable messages to the thousands who lived under Rome's vast shadow. What shocks most people is not that torture existed, but how deeply it was woven into Rome's political identity, transforming agony into a form of communication that reached far beyond the walls of interrogation rooms. In the Roman mind, pain had purpose. It was considered a purifier, a clarifier, a force that stripped away lies and left only truth. That belief created an environment where torture was not only allowed but expected. Underneath the marble temples and bustling markets existed a network of chambers where suffering was manufactured with the same discipline Rome applied to building roads or drilling legions. Lictors trained specifically for these tasks understood that their role was not simply to inflict pain, but to modulate it, control it, shape it into something that served political ends. The instruments they used were not crude improvisations. They were crafted with intent. Hooks, clamps, heated plates, leather straps, and metal scourges were standard tools, each designed to create a distinct pattern of agony that could be escalated or restrained depending on the message the magistrate wished to send. But the Most unsettling aspect was how Rome used torture, not only against individuals, but against groups. A single man broken in a back room could silence an entire household. A slave tortured for evidence could spread fear across an entire community of workers. A political suspect dragged into an interrogation chamber could reshape the loyalties of dozens of onlookers long before the first question was asked. Every scream echoed outward, reinforcing the idea that Roman power extended not just into homes and markets, but into nerve endings and bone. The political nature of torture became especially clear during periods of unrest. When suspicion of treason crept through the Senate or rumors of conspiracy spread across the capital, the threshold for who could be interrogated changed overnight. Senators who once commanded respect found themselves dragged before tribunals. Freedmen who had climbed their way into modest influence suddenly felt the ground vanish beneath them. Even citizens, protected in theory by status and privilege, discovered how fragile those protections were when the state sensed danger. The mere possibility of dissent was enough to justify the opening of the torture chambers, transforming fear into a form of public policy. Imagine standing in a narrow stone corridor, hearing muffled cries from behind a closed door, knowing that the man inside is not a hardened criminal, but someone who once spoke too freely in a tavern or questioned a magistrate in the wrong tone. The guards stationed nearby do not flinch. They have heard this 1,000 times. Their indifference is part of the system, a silent reminder that the state is not merely punishing disobedience, but sculpting obedience through terror. The psychological weight of that environment fell on everyone who lived within the empire's reach. Most people never saw the torture directly, yet its presence shaped their behavior daily. Like a shadow stretching over every transaction, every conversation, every choice. The true power of Roman torture was not in the pain itself, but in its predictability. Everyone knew what could happen. Everyone understood that the machinery existed, always ready to activate. And as the empire expanded, this mechanism refined itself, preparing for the next phase where punishment crossed the boundaries of private chambers and erupted into arenas, forums, and public squares, turning human suffering into a spectacle that shaped the identity of the empire itself. As torture worked silently in the shadows, Rome perfected a second, far more theatrical mechanism of control: public punishment. This was not punishment in the modern sense, where a sentence is carried out behind walls, unseen. Roman punishment was performance, a staged affirmation of power that transformed the suffering of a few into a spectacle absorbed by thousands. The empire understood that what people witnessed shaped what they feared, and what they feared shaped how they behaved. And so, Rome built an entire social order on the ritual of execution, turning plazas, forums, and arenas into extensions of its political will. The forum, which many imagine today as a place of philosophy and civic debate, doubled as a stage where Rome taught its harshest lessons. A condemned man could be marched through the streets stripped of dignity long before he faced the final blow. The procession itself was part of the punishment, forcing the community to observe his fall and absorb the warning. Embedded in every step, when he finally reached the place of execution, the crowd had already been prepared psychologically, primed to see him not as a person, but as a symbol of disobedience crushed under the weight of the state. The forms of execution varied, each chosen with care: crucifixion, scourging to death, burning, exposure to wild animals, and even elaborate reenactments of myths, where the condemned was forced to play the victim in scenes that ended with a real death. These weren't simply methods. They were messages meticulously designed to resonate across every layer of Roman society. Take crucifixion, for example. It wasn't just a slow and agonizing death. It was a statement that the victim's body belonged to the empire, suspended publicly for hours or days, as a reminder of Rome's authority. People passed by, merchants continued their work, children walked alongside parents, all while the condemned hung in plain view. The horror became part of ordinary life. Even more disturbing were the staged executions engineered for maximum psychological impact. Roman officials understood that the crowd wasn't just watching the condemned, they were studying the consequences of disobedience. A thief might be scourged with metal-tipped whips until bones showed through the torn flesh. A deserter might be beaten by his entire unit as a ritual of purification through violence. And those accused of particularly grave offences could face punishments designed not only to kill them, but to erase every trace of their identity, leaving only the memory of suffering behind. Imagine standing in the heat of a Roman afternoon while a sentence is carried out, the air thick with dust and anticipation. The executioner steps forward, instruments gleaming under the sun. The crowd murmurs, shifting in waves as the moment approaches. Somewhere in the crowd, a mother covers her child's eyes. Another parent lets the child watch, believing fear is a necessary lesson. When the final moment arrives, the sound that follows is not silence, but an eruption of voices reacting in shock, approval, or uneasy fascination. And in that charged atmosphere, the empire's message travels farther than any decree could. This system of public cruelty did more than punish crime. It trained the Roman mind to associate order with suffering, stability with submission, and power with the spectacle of pain. The citizens understood that the same forces that entertained them could one day claim them. That knowledge lived quietly inside every household, shaping how people spoke, how they avoided conflict, how they interpreted the boundaries of acceptable behavior. In Rome, fear was not simply an emotion, it was a civic instrument, sharpened and displayed whenever the empire needed to remind its people that obedience was the only safe path forward. If any part of this descent into Rome's public machinery of cruelty unsettled you or made you reflect on how empires mold the minds of their citizens, tell me your thoughts in the comments so I can understand what struck you most and continue shaping this narrative with the weight it deserves. Once you witness how public punishment functioned as a theatrical extension of Roman authority, you begin to see the deeper truth behind it. Rome governed not just through law or military might, but through a precise, calculated manipulation of fear. This fear was not chaotic. It was engineered, woven into the rituals of daily life, forming a silent structure that held the empire together long after swords were sheathed and executions ended. What made Rome truly powerful was not its ability to kill. It was its ability to make people imagine the consequences long before they ever faced them. Roman officials understood something that modern psychologists would later study in detail. Fear is most effective when it is unpredictable. Not random, but unpredictable. A punishment delivered without warning, an accusation that could fall on anyone, a sudden shift in what the state declared criminal or treasonous. These uncertainties created an atmosphere where citizens learned to regulate their own behavior out of caution, not conviction. The empire didn't need to punish everyone, it only needed a few visible examples to keep millions obedient. Think about the ordinary Roman household, a father teaching his son how to navigate social expectations, a mother warning her children to avoid saying the wrong thing in the wrong place. Gossip about a neighbor's arrest spreading through narrow streets, retold in quieter tones each time. This wasn't paranoia. It was survival. People learned early that safety depended on understanding which invisible lines could not be crossed, even when those lines shifted from year to year or ruler to ruler. The uncertainty itself became a tool of governance. The genius of Roman fear was its layering. At the top were the overwhelming spectacles of the arena. Below that, the more intimate terror of the courts and interrogation chambers. Further down, the everyday enforcement carried out by lictors, guards, and officials who walked the streets in uniforms that symbolized authority. Each layer reinforced the others, creating a hierarchy of dread that permeated the empire like a fog. Even those who had never witnessed an execution firsthand could describe the details with chilling accuracy because fear circulated as a shared cultural memory. Rome also exploited the psychology of hierarchy. The empire's strict social stratification meant that people not only feared the state, but feared losing their position within the system. A merchant might fear a fine that could cripple his business. A farmer might fear losing the small protection his patron provided. A slave might fear being sold to a harsh master, or worse, sentenced to labor in the mines where survival was measured in months. Each group internalized its own version of fear, tailored to its vulnerabilities, ensuring that control did not rely on a single pressure point, but on an interlocking web of pressures that shaped every decision. Imagine walking through a Roman marketplace, vibrant and loud, yet beneath the noise is a collective awareness of the consequences of stepping outside the boundaries set by the state. A dispute over a price is tempered by the understanding that attracting the wrong kind of attention could escalate beyond your control. A heated political discussion dies down the moment a stranger approaches. Even personal relationships are shaped by the fear that a careless word could be repeated to the wrong person. Rome did not need spies in every corner. Citizens became their own censors, their own enforcers of an unwritten code. This internalized fear was Rome's most efficient weapon. It traveled faster than soldiers, lasted longer than decrees, and reached deeper than any spear. It shaped the minds of millions across cities, provinces, and far-flung territories. People obeyed not because they believed in the fairness of the system, but because the cost of disobedience had been made vividly clear through a lifetime of examples, both public and hidden. And this fear, once embedded in the collective consciousness, prepared them for the even more insidious punishments the empire carried out quietly, away from the roar of crowds and the spectacle of executions. If the public executions and theatrical displays of suffering shaped the surface of Roman society, it was the invisible punishments, the ones rarely written, rarely witnessed, deliberately obscured, that revealed the empire's true mastery of control. These punishments existed in the spaces between law and spectacle, where Rome crafted consequences so subtle, so quiet, that they reshaped lives without ever becoming part of official history. To understand them is to see how deeply the empire infiltrated the private world of its subjects, reaching into households, reputations, and futures with the same precision it used in its grand arenas. Many of these punishments were administrative, hidden behind the smooth language of Roman bureaucracy. A magistrate could issue a decision that did not kill or torture, but still destroyed the foundation of a person's life. A man could be stripped of citizenship, a punishment that effectively erased him from the political body of Rome. Suddenly, he lost the right to vote, to appeal, to own property with security. He became vulnerable to any accusation, unable to defend himself through the channels he once trusted. No blood was spilled, no crowd gathered, yet the punishment hollowed out his existence as thoroughly as any execution. Another invisible punishment was social ruin, engineered by targeted humiliation or forced silence. A merchant accused of dishonesty might not be physically harmed, but word would spread in ways that guaranteed he would never again find customers willing to trust him. A freedman who displeased a patron could be sent back into slavery, not as an official sentence, but through the manipulation of debts, contracts, and legal loopholes. Even accusations that were never proven could stain a family for generations, tightening the empire's grip not just on individuals, but on entire bloodlines. Then there were punishments tied to labor, perhaps the most overlooked aspect of Roman cruelty. Rome maintained mines so brutal that they were known as living tombs. Assignment to these places did not require a trial. A simple administrative decision could condemn a person to years of toil underground, breathing toxic dust, carrying stones until their bodies collapsed. Most died within months, their names forgotten, their sentences unrecorded. These punishments allowed Rome to dispose of undesirables quietly, turning suffering into economic output without drawing public attention. Even within the military, where honor and discipline were prized, invisible punishments operated beneath the surface. A soldier who showed hesitation in battle might not be officially condemned, but his unit could be assigned to the front lines in the most dangerous positions over and over, a slow erosion of survival disguised as routine deployment. A centurion who angered a superior could be transferred to remote outposts where disease, starvation, or hostile tribes eliminated him without a single stroke of the executioner's hand. The empire understood how to turn geography itself into a sentence. Perhaps the most haunting invisible punishment was forced exile. To be exiled from Rome was to lose not only your home but your identity. The empire was the center of the world, and being pushed to its fringes meant being socially dismantled. Exile operated like a slow, psychological death. You watched life continue without you, knowing that every friend, every colleague, every voice in the forum carried on as if you had never existed. This form of erasure was so effective that many exiles simply faded into obscurity, their fates unknown even to those who once knew them well. What made these invisible punishments so powerful was their silence. There was no audience, no spectacle, no heroic last stand to etch the victim's memory into the minds of others. The empire learned that some of the most effective forms of control leave no scars for future generations to uncover. And it is within this quiet, calculated shadow that Rome perfected the next evolution of cruelty, where humiliation and pain fused into methods designed not only to punish, but to unravel a person from the inside out, ensuring that their suffering became a private echo the empire never had to acknowledge. As Rome refined its invisible punishments, the empire also expanded its arsenal of methods that operated in an even more chilling territory. Punishments designed not just to harm the body or ruin a reputation, but to dismantle a person's sense of self from the inside. These were the forms of cruelty that left victims alive yet unreachable, stripped of identity, stripped of voice, and stripped of the internal stability that allows a human being to remain whole. Rome understood that breaking a body created an example. Breaking a mind created a warning that endured far longer. One of the most feared of these methods was the practice known broadly as supplicium. The word simply meant punishment, but its application carried an unspoken meaning. Degradation so complete that the victim became something less than human. These punishments often began with public dishonor. A man accused of violating Rome's moral order might be paraded through the streets in chains, forced to endure insults, filth thrown by onlookers, or forced nudity meant to collapse the barrier between private dignity and public humiliation. In the Roman worldview, honor was as vital as breath. To lose it was to be symbolically erased even before physical punishments began. But Rome did not stop at humiliation. Many forms of supplicium targeted a person's psychological core. A citizen could be forced to confess crimes he did not commit, not through physical torment alone, but through manipulation engineered to make him doubt his own memories, motives, and loyalties. Some victims were compelled to witness the punishment of loved ones, not as part of a legal sentence, but as a tool to fracture emotional bonds. Rome knew that destroying a person's relationships destroyed their strength, their courage, their place within their community. By shattering the connections that gave life meaning, the empire crafted punishments that continued long after the visible wounds had healed. There were also methods intended to enforce silence, ensuring the victim could never speak of what had been done. Some were literal, tongues cut, vocal cords damaged, jaws broken and forced to heal improperly. Others were psychological, isolation that lasted months or years, deprivation of human contact, banishment to dark spaces beneath. Fortresses or amphitheaters, where the only sound was the echo of one's own breathing. These punishments left people alive, but emptied, carrying a quiet suffering that the empire considered more useful than death. A silent victim was a living testament to Roman authority, a figure who walked among others but carried the weight of an experience too terrible to express. Rome also engineered punishments that targeted identity itself. A disgraced soldier could be forced to wear symbols of cowardice. A nobleman could be assigned tasks normally given to slaves, not for labor but for degradation. A woman accused of violating societal expectations might be confined in ways that erased her status and autonomy, transforming her into a symbol of disobedience that others were expected to observe and internalize. These punishments reshaped how victims saw themselves, teaching them to adopt the labels Rome imposed upon them. When the body accepts chains, Rome wins. When the mind accepts them, Rome triumphs completely. Imagine walking past someone who has endured such punishment. They move through the streets with eyes lowered, shoulders heavy, a quiet resignation that tells more than any official decree. The empire did not need them to speak. Their silence was enough. People saw them and understood instinctively that Rome could reach into the deepest parts of a person and tear something essential away, leaving them physically present but spiritually diminished. This fear spread through households, marketplaces, and barracks, teaching everyone that survival depended not merely on obedience but on self-erasure when the state demanded it. If this glimpse into the hidden, intimate cruelty of Rome stirred something in you or made you reflect on the ways power can break the human spirit, tell me your thoughts in the comments so I can continue shaping the next parts of this descent with the weight and precision this subject demands. As Rome perfected the invisible and psychological punishments, the empire did not abandon the physical body as a canvas for authority. In fact, the human form became one of its most effective instruments, a living warning displayed for those who might question or resist. Every execution, every branding, every forced labor assignment was carefully calibrated to demonstrate that the consequences of defiance extended beyond the individual. The body itself became a message that could be read across provinces, markets, and military camps. Consider the arena, but not as a spectacle of gladiators and trained animals. Below that surface existed a system that treated the human body as a signpost of imperial will. Prisoners, criminals, rebels, or slaves were arranged, displayed, and exposed in ways that communicated hierarchy and consequence. Crucifixions were erected along roads for weeks, allowing travelers to witness the fate of anyone who defied Rome. Bodies were positioned deliberately, sometimes in geometric patterns, so that the landscape itself carried warnings of obedience and submission. Even those who never witnessed the executions directly internalized the lessons through rumor and sightlines, creating a pervasive culture of fear. But beyond the arena, Rome used the body as a tool of intimidation in everyday life. Laborers, soldiers, and citizens were subject to corporal punishments that were both functional and symbolic. Whippings left patterned scars meant to signify crimes, failures, or disobedience. Limbs could be impaired deliberately, not to kill, but to produce lasting reminders of authority. The empire understood that the permanence of injury, the visible transformation of a body, carried a lesson more enduring than death itself. A man with a scar on his back became a mobile warning, his suffering converted into a lesson for anyone who saw him. Women, too, were subjected to calculated forms of punishment that manipulated their bodies to assert control. The state enforced modesty, imposed isolation, or assigned tasks that ensured humiliation while maintaining the victim's survival. These methods were designed to strip autonomy and enforce a constant awareness of vulnerability. The body's exposure became a psychological weapon, signaling both the reach of authority and the futility of resistance. In this way, Roman control was internalized. People began policing themselves, knowing that the consequences of rebellion could manifest not only in pain, but in permanent alteration of their physical existence. Even soldiers, trained to endure hardship, could not escape the body as a medium of state power. Repeated drills under extreme conditions, exposure to injuries, and forced demonstrations of punishment created a culture where fear of the body's limitations, its capacity to endure pain or collapse, reinforced obedience. The empire taught that mastery over others relied not solely on conquest, but on the ability to shape bodies, to turn the physical form into an instrument of compliance and exemplification. The genius of this approach was subtle. Rome never needed to constantly kill or brand everyone. By targeting a few and making their bodies visible in specific ways, the empire instilled caution in millions. Citizens, soldiers, and slaves internalized this strategy, learning to anticipate pain and conformity without direct confrontation. The human body became both a tool and a message, a living medium through which Rome maintained control across its vast territories. And as the empire advanced, it refined these methods further, combining them with psychological manipulation, invisibility, and public spectacle to achieve near-complete domination of mind, spirit, and flesh. As the empire expanded, so did the system that transformed human suffering into a tool of governance. Behind every spectacle, behind every punishment, there existed an intricate network of magistrates, lictors, and professional executioners who turned cruelty into a precise industry. These individuals were not rogue agents of violence. They were components of a machine designed to maintain the hierarchy, enforce obedience, and communicate power through the language of pain. Every action was codified, every instrument calibrated, every procedure meticulously planned to leave the population aware of what transgression could cost. The magistrates themselves held enormous authority over life and death. Their decisions were rarely questioned. Their interpretations of law carried the weight of the state, and their reach extended into both public and private spheres. These officials were responsible for ensuring that punishments were not only delivered, but also witnessed, internalized, and remembered. The subtlety of their role lay in the combination of legality and terror. A citizen punished in accordance with law could see the legitimacy of the empire reinforced, even as their spirit was crushed. Justice became inseparable from fear, making the empire's authority feel inevitable and unassailable. Executioners, on the other hand, were specialists in the art of suffering. Their skills went far beyond wielding blades or operating instruments of torture. They understood how to modulate pain, how to prolong agony to maximize psychological impact without causing premature death, and how to stage punishments so that the lesson extended beyond the individual victim. They were engineers of compliance, architects of dread. Every lash, every burn, every forced kneeling or bending had purpose. The empire treated them as essential personnel, much like officers or administrators, because the psychological control they exerted was as valuable as the swords and shields of Rome's legions. This industry of pain extended even into the bureaucratic documentation of punishment. Records were kept with meticulous precision. Names, offenses, methods applied, duration and outcomes were all logged. These records served multiple functions. They allowed magistrates to justify future punishments, enabled state officials to monitor trends in obedience, and created a chilling archive of authority where the knowledge of past suffering could be invoked to influence behavior before any act of disobedience occurred. In this way, Rome institutionalized cruelty, embedding it in the very paperwork that supposedly represented law and governance. Even more sophisticated was the coordination between magistrates and executioners to create a culture of anticipation. People did not need to witness every punishment personally. Rumor, fear, and the visible effects on victims circulating through streets, forums, and households were enough to sustain compliance. A scar, a missing limb, or a man publicly humiliated could communicate the empire's message more effectively than edicts. Rome's power relied on this invisible network, a system where pain became both pedagogy and deterrent, turning each citizen into a participant in their own subjugation, watching others as a warning, internalizing the lessons, and perpetuating obedience without direct intervention. The empire's approach to punishment was systematic, multi-layered, and remarkably efficient. It merged spectacle, legality, psychology, and labor into a single cohesive strategy of control. This industrialization of suffering ensured that Rome could maintain dominance over millions with far fewer soldiers or overt acts of violence than might be expected. The lesson was clear. In the empire, power was not only enforced through force, but also through the careful orchestration of fear, anticipation, and compliance, making each citizen both observer and participant in the machinery of domination. By now, the layers of Roman punishment reveal a chilling truth. The empire's power did not rely solely on armies or conquest. It relied on the mastery of human suffering, a sophisticated system that integrated public spectacle, invisible punishments, psychological manipulation, and bureaucratic oversight. Rome understood that controlling the mind, spirit, and body of its citizens was far more effective than simply striking with the sword. The state had engineered fear so deeply that obedience became internalized, a silent covenant enforced in every household, marketplace, and barracks across the empire. Consider how the combination of public executions, private torture, humiliation, and coerced labor created a population that monitored itself. Every citizen, soldier, and slave became a participant in a system designed to maintain dominance without requiring constant intervention. Bodies displayed as warnings, whispered rumors of secret punishments, scars carried through neighborhoods, and the meticulous records kept by magistrates reinforced compliance at every level. Rome's power was invisible and omnipresent, a shadow cast over the lives of millions that shaped choices, speech, and behavior, even in moments of privacy. And yet, within this system, the human cost was immense. Lives were destroyed not only through death, but through the slow erosion of identity, dignity, and autonomy. Families were torn apart, communities were destabilized, and the psychological scars of fear endured long after the visible punishments ended. Each individual subjected to Rome's machinery became both a victim and a warning, their suffering converted into a tool for social control. The empire's brilliance was inseparable from its cruelty, and the lesson etched into the fabric of history is one that cannot be ignored. It is precisely this understanding that separates modern observation from historical myth. Rome was more than a civilization of conquest and culture. It was a calculated machine of human management, where compliance, fear, and ritualized suffering ensured dominance across continents. Every method, from the public execution to the silent punishment, served a singular purpose: to demonstrate systematically and relentlessly that the empire's authority was absolute, and that resistance carried consequences far beyond immediate injury. The citizens who survived internalized these lessons, perpetuating order without constant oversight, a testament to the efficiency and terror of the system itself. Now, having witnessed the full scope of Rome's punitive machinery, you can see the empire in a light few ever recognize. The human body, mind, and spirit were instruments in a broader strategy of control, an orchestration of fear that shaped generations. If you have followed this journey to the very edge of the empire's darkest practices, leave a comment with the phrase, "This message was for me," to show you reach the end. Share your thoughts on how these punishments affected human behavior, and make sure to click like if the insight impacted you. Also, if you are not yet subscribed, do so to continue exploring the hidden truths of history. And there is more to uncover. There is a video waiting alongside this one that delves even deeper into the systems of power and cruelty. Click and continue with me to see what other lessons Rome tried and failed to conceal.